Hey guys, Daniel here, and today I want to talk about do only combat veterans get PTSD? And I think that's a very dangerous stereotype that's floating around. And after one of my last videos, somebody put that in the comments section. They're like, "Do only combat veterans get post-traumatic stress disorder?" And like I said, no, that's not the case. And I used to think that as well. Before I entered the military, I had no idea what a traumatic event was. I had no idea that what post-traumatic stress disorder was. So I came back, and then I had post-traumatic stress disorder, and I went through the process of getting the help that I needed to live a happy, healthy life. And then after that, I started to teach people about post-traumatic stress disorder, and I teach it to anybody, like anybody that would listen. I would, and a lot of times civilians would come to my seminars, and I talk about it, and then afterwards they'd approach me and they say, I just came here because I wanted to hear what you were talking about today, but those nightmares, I had those after my car accident. Those flashbacks, I had those after I was abused as a child. And I started to look into it, and over 85% of people, that exist are going to have some sort of traumatic event in their lives. And not all of it's going to lead to post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic growth or whatever, but 85% of people are going to have some sort of traumatic event. And the definition of traumatic event, you've probably seen my previous videos, is anything that shatters your assumptive world and your place in it. So 85% of people that are out and about are gonna be in a car accident that shatters their assumptive world. They're gonna experience post-traumatic stress after they're sexually assaulted. They're gonna suffer post-traumatic stress after they've been robbed, after they've lost their child, after they've lost their parents, after they've been emotionally abused, after they've been physically abused, whatever the case may be. And so that the short answer to that question is no. Not only combat veterans get post-traumatic stress disorder. We're all exposed to the trials and tribulations of life, and not everybody's going to live a really, really easy life. And those that do go through a traumatic event definitely can get post-traumatic stress disorder. But that doesn't mean that just because you go through a traumatic event that you're going to get post-traumatic stress disorder. It just kind of opens you up to the possibility. And I also want to address another, very dangerous stereotype that I feel is that there is no traumatic event that's worse than somebody else's traumatic event. Okay, and I think that's kind of a subset of do only combat veterans get PTSD? Well, if they don't, then is a combat veteran's PTSD worse than my PTSD, right? Because a combat veteran saw his buddy die in combat. Is that worse than my PTSD when I got jumped, and robbed or whatever? And, the answer is, I could talk about this all day long, but the answer is no, okay? The answer is that I want to say two different things about that. One, I want to say that the human mind cannot differentiate between emotional pain and physical pain, okay? So going through a traumatic event in the mind's eye is just as bad as getting your leg broken, okay? So emotional pain is real pain. So I think that's one dangerous stereotype. And the other one is that a traumatic event is a traumatic event, okay? So like I said, a soldier that, got injured in Iraq, their traumatic event is no more or less serious than somebody that was sexually assaulted or whatever the case may be. And that person's traumatic event is no more or less traumatic than somebody that I saw somebody get killed in the civilian world, like during a robbery or something like that. So tracking back on that, I want to say all those people that have been through a traumatic event, anybody can get post-traumatic stress disorder. But the more important thing that I try to push to my organization is that anybody that goes through a traumatic event is pretty much open to the 3 different outcomes that can happen after you go through a traumatic event. And I know there's like a million different outcomes, but I'm going to oversimplify it here into 3 different outcomes. And the first one is that most people that go through a traumatic event are going to have little to no effect for the rest of their lives. The basis of a traumatic event means it's going to shake the world right then and there. Let's use a car accident for example. They're not going to want to drive for the rest of the day, and the day after that, they might not want to drive. But if they do, they're going to put on a seatbelt and watch everything that's going on and be shaken up. But, you know, a week later, they're gonna be driving, they're gonna be changing the radio, they're gonna be doing all kind of, you know, stuff that they wouldn't have been doing the day that they got into the traumatic event. And so another option of that, the big three, is one is that they can get post-traumatic stress disorder, which means those nightmares, the flashbacks, all that stuff happens for a prolonged period of time. But the beautiful thing is that also what can happen after you go through a traumatic event is after you kind of ride that wave and after you go through the ebbs and flows of it, you can get post-traumatic growth, which means that you have positive psychological outcomes that occurred from going through that traumatic event. So that means, you know, you're closer with your God, you're closer with your family, you know, you're more compassionate for other people. You know, you're just a better person overall for experiencing that traumatic event. So I know I kind of rambled on there for a little bit, but the short answer was, do only combat veterans get PTSD? And the answer is no. Hopefully this video helped. Thanks.